The hospital corridor felt endless as Catherine walked beside her husband David, their footsteps echoing against the sterile walls. After 23 years of marriage, she knew his every expression, every gesture. Today, his jaw was set in that familiar way that meant he was fighting to stay strong, but his trembling hands betrayed the fear he tried so hard to hide. Dr. Martinez had called them back after the test results came in. Catherine remembered how David had joked nervously in the waiting room just an hour ago, making her laugh despite her worry. He always did that, found ways to make light of serious situations. It was one of the things that had drawn her to him when they first met at the university library all those years ago. The doctor's office smelled of disinfectant and old coffee. Family photos lined the walls, smiling children, graduation ceremonies, wedding pictures. Catherine found herself staring at them, wondering if those families had ever sat in chairs like these, hearing words that would change everything. The scans show that the tumor has grown, Dr. Martinez said gently, her voice carrying the weight of delivering countless difficult conversations. We're looking at stage 4 now. The treatment options we discussed before are no longer viable. Catherine felt the world tilt slightly. David's hand found hers immediately, their fingers intertwining in a grip that spoke of decades of shared storms weathered together. She watched his face, saw the moment the words truly sank in. His blue eyes, still as bright as the day she'd fallen in love with them, filled with tears he refused to let fall. "How long?" David asked, his voice steady despite everything. "With palliative care, possibly 6 months, maybe longer with your strength and determination." The silence that followed was deafening. Catherine could hear her own heartbeat, could feel David's pulse through his wrist where it pressed against hers. 6 months. The number hung in the air like a countdown timer that had suddenly begun ticking much too fast. David squeezed her hand. 3 times. Their old signal from when the children were small. "I love you." She squeezed back 4 times. "I love you too." They drove home in relative quiet, the radio playing soft music that seemed inappropriate for such a moment. Catherine watched familiar streets pass by the window. The coffee shop where they'd had their first date, the park where they'd taught their children to ride bikes, the little bookstore where David still bought her surprise novels on random Tuesdays. Everything looked exactly the same, yet everything had changed completely. At home, their golden retriever Max bounded toward them with his usual enthusiasm, tail wagging as if this were any other Tuesday afternoon. David knelt down to scratch behind Max's ears, and Catherine saw his shoulders shake slightly. The dog seemed to sense something too, settling quietly beside David instead of demanding his usual energetic play session. Their house felt different now, heavier somehow. The family photos on the mantel, the children's artwork still hanging, on the refrigerator despite them being adults now, the cozy reading nook by the window where they spent Sunday mornings with coffee and crossword puzzles. All of it suddenly precious in a way it had never been before. Catherine made tea while David sat at the kitchen table, staring out at the garden they'd planted together 15 years ago. The roses were blooming beautifully this year, their red, petals bright against the green leaves. He'd been so proud of those roses, spending countless weekend hours tending to them, talking to them as if they were old friends. "We need to tell the children," he said finally. Their daughter Emma lived 3 hours away with her husband and 2 young children. Their son Michael was finishing his residency at the hospital downtown. Both of them called every Sunday without fail, sharing stories about their lives, asking for advice, making plans for holidays and family gatherings. How do you tell your children that those plans need to change? That the future everyone has been building toward suddenly has a different timeline? Catherine set the tea down in front of David and took the chair beside him. The same chairs they'd sat in for thousands of meals, homework sessions, and late-night conversations about everything and nothing. "Not today," she said softly. "Let's have today. Just us. We'll tell them tomorrow." David nodded, understanding immediately. They'd always been good at reading each other's needs, at knowing when to push forward and when to pause. They spent the evening doing ordinary things that felt extraordinary now. David read while Catherine worked on her latest knitting project. a blanket she'd started for Emma's youngest. They ordered Chinese food from their favorite restaurant, watching old movies on the couch with Max curled up between them. As bedtime approached, Catherine found herself memorizing moments. The way David laughed at a joke in the movie, how he absently petted Max's fur, the concentration on his face as he tried to solve a difficult crossword clue. In their bedroom, as they got ready for sleep, David caught her reflection in the mirror. "I'm scared, Cat," he whispered, using the nickname only he was allowed to use. She turned to face him, reaching up to touch his cheek. "I know. Me too." But even in their fear, there was something else, a determination that had carried them through previous challenges. The miscarriage early in their marriage, David's father's death, Catherine's battle with depression after Michael was born, financial struggles when David's business nearly failed. They had weathered storms before. This one was different, but they would face it together, just as they always had. The next morning arrived too soon and not soon enough. Catherine woke to find David already up, standing by their bedroom window watching the sunrise paint the sky in shades of gold and pink. He'd always been an early riser, but lately, sleep had become elusive for both of them. "Beautiful morning," he said without turning around when he heard her stirring. Catherine joined him at the window, slipping her arm around his waist. The familiar weight of him against her side was comforting. Solid, real. "The roses look perfect from up here," she observed. They made breakfast together, moving around their kitchen in the choreographed dance of a couple who had shared the space for decades. David scrambled eggs while Catherine toasted bread and prepared fresh fruit. Max sat hopefully by his food bowl, tail thumping against the cabinet. "Emma first or Michael?" David asked as he slid eggs onto their plates. "Emma," Catherine decided. "She'll want more time to process before she has to be strong for the kids." They called their daughter after breakfast. Emma answered on the second ring, her voice bright with the chaos of morning routines, getting 7-year-old Sophie ready for school while keeping 4-year-old Tommy from destroying the living room. "Mom, perfect timing. Tommy just painted the dog with yogurt and Sophie can't find her library book anywhere. Please tell me you're calling with normal parent problems to make me feel better about my life." Catherine felt her heart constrict. In 30 seconds, Emma's world would change forever. Her daughter's laughter, so carefree and ordinary, would never sound quite the same again. "Sweetheart, is there a time today when you could talk? Dad and I need to share something with you and Michael." The quality of silence that followed told Catherine that Emma had caught the serious tone immediately. Her daughter had always been perceptive, able to read between lines and sense undercurrents others missed. "Is everything okay?" Emma's voice had shifted, becoming careful, cautious. David leaned closer to the phone. "We'd rather talk to both of you together if possible. Can you drive down this evening? We'll call Michael too." "Dad, you're scaring me. Just tell me what's wrong." Catherine closed her eyes, picturing Emma in her kitchen 3 hours away, probably setting down whatever she'd been holding, her mind already racing through possibilities. "The doctor's appointment yesterday. We got some difficult news, but we want to tell you and Michael together, okay? Can you come?" "I'm leaving now," Emma said immediately. "I'll call Jake to pick up the kids from school. I'll be there by lunch." "Emma, you don't have to." "Mom, I'm coming. I'll see you soon." The line went dead and Catherine stared at the phone. She could picture Emma already moving, probably already. Mentally packing a bag, mind churning with worry and questions. Michael was between shifts at the hospital, and when they called, he answered with the brisk efficiency of someone accustomed to medical emergencies. "Hey, what's up? Can you come by the house tonight? We need to talk to you and Emma about something important." Unlike his sister, Michael went quiet for a long moment. As a medical resident, he'd learned to read between the lines of careful conversations, to understand what people weren't saying, as much as what they were. "This is about Dad's tests, isn't it?" David and Catherine exchanged glances. Their son had always been direct, sometimes painfully so. Even as a child, Michael had preferred hard truths to gentle deflections. "Yes," David said simply. "But we want to tell you both together." I can be there by 7. Is it? How bad is it, Dad? The question hung in the air like smoke, impossible to ignore or brush away. Catherine watched David struggle with how much to say, how much to hold back until their family was gathered together. We'll talk tonight, son. I love you. I love you too, Dad. The hours until evening crawled by with agonizing slowness. Emma arrived just after lunch, bursting through the front door with the energy she'd had since childhood, never able to simply enter a room when she could make an entrance instead. But today, her usual brightness was dimmed by worry. She hugged both parents tightly, holding on longer than usual, and Catherine could feel her daughter's fear in the tension of her shoulders. The kids are staying with Jake's parents for the night, Emma announced, settling into the living room couch where she'd spent countless hours as a teenager, talking about boys and school and dreams for the future. I told Sophie that Grandpa wasn't feeling well and needed some quiet time. How much does she understand? Catherine asked, sitting beside Emma while David took his usual chair by the window. She knows something's wrong. She's 7, Mom. Kids. That age pick up on everything, even when we think we're hiding it well. Michael arrived at 7 sharp, still wearing scrubs from the hospital. He looked tired in the way that medical residents always look tired but alert. He kissed Catherine's cheek and clasped David's shoulder in a brief, firm grip that spoke of masculine affection. Okay, he said, settling into the chair across from his parents. Let's hear it. David took Catherine's hand and looked at their children, Emma, whose expressive face already showed the strain of hours of worry, and Michael, whose medical training had taught him to brace for difficult news. The cancer has spread, David said quietly. The doctor says we're looking at about 6 months, maybe a little more. Emma's sharp intake of breath was audible in the sudden silence. Michael's face went very still, his medical training warring with the reality that this was his father, not a patient. What are the treatment options? Michael asked, falling into clinical mode. Have you gotten a second opinion? What about experimental treatments, clinical trials? David shook his head. We've explored everything, son. Dr. Martinez has been very thorough. We're past the point where treatment would help. Emma had been unnaturally quiet, and when Catherine looked at her, tears were streaming down her daughter's face. 6 months, she whispered. That's nothing. That's no time at all. It's the time we have, David said gently. And we're going to make it count. The conversation that followed was unlike any their family had ever had. They talked about practical things, wills and finances, medical decisions, how to tell the grandchildren. But beneath the logistics ran a current of grief so profound that it threatened to pull them all under. Michael, true to his nature, asked direct medical questions. Emma wanted to know about pain management, about what the progression would look like, about whether David would be able to continue doing the things he loved. As the evening wore on, something shifted in the room. The initial shock began to transform into something else. Not acceptance exactly, but a kind of fierce determination. They were a family, and they would face this together, just as they had faced everything else. I want to take some time off. Work, Emma announced around 10 o'clock. Jake and I talked about it on the phone this afternoon. We can manage financially for a while, and I want to spend time here. You don't need to do that, David started, but Emma cut him off. Yes, I absolutely do need to do that, Michael nodded. I can adjust my schedule too. Trade some shifts, work nights when possible so I can be here during the day. Catherine felt tears prick her eyes, but these were different from the tears of fear and grief she'd been fighting since yesterday. These were tears of gratitude, of overwhelming love for these two people who had somehow grown into adults capable of such strength and generosity. When Emma and Michael finally left that night, the house felt both emptier and fuller somehow. Emptier because their children were gone, fuller because it now held the weight of shared knowledge of a family circling close to protect one of its own. Catherine and David sat in their living room long after the car lights disappeared down their street, holding hands in the lamplight, beginning to understand that the hardest conversations were sometimes also the most necessary ones. 2 weeks after the diagnosis, the Roberts family house had transformed into something that resembled a reunion, crossed with a celebration. Emma had indeed taken leave from her job, and she'd moved temporarily into her old bedroom with frequent visits from Jake and the grandchildren. Michael had rearranged his schedule so dramatically that his colleagues were covering extra shifts, though none of them questioned why when he explained the situation. The kitchen table that had once hosted homework sessions and family dinners now served as mission control for what Emma had dubbed Dad's Adventure List, a collection of experiences and activities that David had always wanted to do, but had put off for some day. "Okay," Emma announced over breakfast, consulting her notebook with the seriousness of a military strategist. "Today we're tackling number 7, teach Sophie how to fish." David looked up from his coffee, eyebrows raised. "Sweetheart, I've never been fishing in my life." "Which is exactly why it's on the list," Michael added, walking into the kitchen with his hair still damp from a shower. "YouTube University, Dad. We'll figure it out together." The fishing expedition proved to be equal parts disaster and delight. David had watched 3 instructional videos the night before, but translating theoretical knowledge into actual practice while dealing with a 7-year-old's endless questions and a 4-year-old's attention span proved challenging. Sophie, however, was enchanted. She sat beside her grandfather on the small dock at Miller's Pond, her fishing pole nearly as tall as she was, chattering about everything and nothing while occasionally remembering to watch her bobber. "Grandpa, why do fish live in water instead of in houses like us?" "Well, they have gills instead of lungs, so they breathe water instead of air." "But wouldn't it be more fun to live in houses? They could have beds and toys and everything," David smiled, adjusting Sophie's grip on her fishing pole. "I think they probably like their water world just fine. Look at how beautifully they can swim and dive. We can't do that." Tommy lasted approximately 15 minutes before declaring, fishing boring and wandering off to collect interesting rocks with Catherine. But Sophie remained devoted to the task, her tongue poking out slightly in concentration as she waited for fish that seemed to have no interest in their amateur bait selection. Emma sat on the grass behind them, ostensibly reading but actually watching her father with her daughter. There was something magical about seeing him through Sophie's eyes, not as a man facing a terminal diagnosis, but simply as Grandpa, the person who told the best bedtime stories and always had butterscotch candies in his pocket. "Grandpa, when I grow up, will you teach me to drive?" The question was innocent, the way all of Sophie's questions were, but it landed like a physical blow. David's hand stilled on the fishing pole, and Emma saw her mother's shoulders tense where she was crouching with Tommy near the water's edge. "We'll see, sweetheart," David said finally, his voice steady. "That's still a long way away." Sophie, satisfied with this non-answer in the way that 7-year-olds often are, returned her attention to fish watching. But the question hung in the air, a reminder that time was not infinite, that some promises couldn't be made. That evening, after the grandchildren had been returned to Jake and everyone had cleaned fish pond mud from various clothing items, the adults sat on the back porch watching the sunset paint David's rose garden in golden light. "She doesn't really understand, does she?" David asked quietly. Emma shook her head. "We've told her you're sick, but the concept of not getting better, it's too abstract for her. She thinks all sickness is temporary." "Maybe that's better for now," Catherine said. "Let her have this time without the weight of understanding." Michael, who had been uncharacteristically quiet all day, finally spoke. "I've been thinking about what happens when we have to tell them. The kids, I mean. How do you explain death to a 4-year-old and a 7-year-old? It was a conversation they'd been avoiding, dancing around the edges of it for weeks. But Michael's directness, as always, cut straight to the heart of matters everyone else was tiptoeing around. "Honestly," Emma said, drawing her knees up to her chest in a gesture that made her look exactly like the teenager she'd once been. "I don't know. I've read articles and books, but it all feels so inadequate. How do you tell Sophie that Grandpa won't be at her birthday parties anymore? That he won't see her graduate or get married or have children of her own?" David reached over and took Emma's hand. "You tell her that Grandpa loved her with everything he had for as long as he could. You tell her that love doesn't end just because someone isn't physically here anymore. Will she understand that? Maybe not at first, but someday she will." The same. Next few weeks fell into a rhythm unlike anything the family had experienced before. Days were structured around David's energy levels. Mornings were usually good for activities and adventures. Afternoons were better for quieter pursuits, and evenings were for family time and conversations. They checked items off the adventure list with methodical determination. David learned to play guitar, badly, but with enthusiasm that made up for his lack of natural talent. They took a weekend trip to the mountains where David had always wanted to hike, modifying their expectations when his stamina proved less than anticipated, but finding beauty in shorter walks and longer conversations by the campfire. Catherine started a photo project, creating albums for each grandchild filled with pictures of them with their grandfather, along with handwritten stories about their adventures together. She found herself studying David's face in these photos, memorizing the way his eyes crinkled when he laughed, the gesture he made with his hands when he was explaining something important. One afternoon, while Emma was at the grocery store and Michael was working, Catherine found David in his study going through old photo albums. Spread across his desk were pictures spanning their entire marriage, their wedding day, the children as babies, family vacations, birthday parties, ordinary moments that had seemed unremarkable when they were living them. "What are you doing?" she asked, settling into the chair beside his desk. "Making piles," David said, indicating several stacks of photos. "Pictures for Emma, pictures for Michael, pictures for the grandchildren when they're older. And these," he gestured to a smaller pile, "these are just for you." Catherine picked up the photos designated for her. Most were pictures she'd never seen before. Candid shots David had taken over the years when she wasn't looking. Catherine reading in their garden. Catherine laughing at something one of the children had said. Catherine asleep on the couch with baby Michael in her arms. "When did you take all these?" "Over the years. You never noticed because you were always busy living life instead of watching yourself live it." She studied a picture of herself from maybe 10 years ago, standing in their kitchen with flour in her hair, grinning at something beyond the camera's range. She barely remembered the moment, but David had captured it, preserved it, kept it all these years. "I want you to look at these after," David said quietly. "When you're missing me, I want you to remember that this is how I saw you every day, not just beautiful but alive, so completely alive." Catherine felt tears threatening, but they were different tears than the ones she'd been crying since the diagnosis. These were tears of gratitude for a love that had been deeper than she'd even realized, for a man who had been quietly documenting their life together because he understood, even then, how precious and fleeting it all was. That evening, as they sat together in their reading nook with cups of tea and the crossword puzzle they'd been working on for 3 days, Catherine realized that this time, this strange, heartbreaking, beautiful time, was also a gift. How many people get the chance to say everything that needs to be said, to love someone completely while they're still here to receive it? The diagnosis had changed everything, but it had also clarified everything, stripped away all the small concerns and daily frustrations to reveal what had always been true, that love, in the end, was the only thing that really mattered. October arrived with a chill that seemed to seep into David's bones more deeply than previous years. The adventure list had grown shorter as his energy waned, but his determination to have meaningful conversations with each person he loved had only intensified. Catherine watched him approach these talks with the same methodical care he'd once applied to business presentations or home improvement projects. The conversation with Michael came first, on a Tuesday afternoon when Emma had taken the grandchildren to the park and Catherine was napping. Father and son sat in David's study, surrounded by the books and papers that had accumulated over decades of quiet contemplation. "I need to tell you some things," David began, settling into his leather chair with the careful movements that had become necessary over the past month. Man to man, father to father, Michael, now 31 and a doctor himself, still looked remarkably like the serious little boy who used to sit in this same chair, asking endless questions about how things worked. "I'm proud of the man you've become," David continued. "Not just because you're a doctor, though that's remarkable, but because you're kind. You could have let all that medical training make you cold, clinical. Instead, it made you more compassionate." Michael shifted uncomfortably the way he always did when receiving direct praise. Dad, you don't need to. Yes, I do. Let me finish. David's voice carried the gentle authority that had guided his children through scraped knees and broken hearts in teenage rebellion. When you have children someday, you'll understand this need to say things out loud instead of assuming they. No, they talked for 2 hours. David shared stories about Michael's childhood that his son had never heard. Moments of pride and worry and overwhelming love that fathers often keep to themselves. He talked about watching Michael learn to walk, to read, to stand up for himself when older kids teased him about his thick glasses. You were never the loudest kid or the most outgoing, David said, but you were always the most thoughtful. Even as a toddler, you'd sit and really consider things before acting. That served you well. Michael's composure finally cracked when David handed him a letter sealed in an envelope. For your wedding day, David explained. Whenever that might be. I won't be there to give the traditional father of the groom speech, so I wrote it down. Michael stared at the envelope with his name written in his father's careful handwriting. Dad, I'm not even seeing anyone seriously right now. You will be. And when you are, and when you're ready to marry her, you'll read this. It contains everything I would want to tell you about love and marriage and building a life with someone. The conversation with Emma happened 3 days later, in the garden among David's roses. Emma had been quieter lately, the initial determined cheerfulness giving way to something more subdued as the reality of the situation settled in. They sat on the old wooden bench David had built years ago, when Emma was in high school and going through a phase of insisting that the garden needed a proper sitting spot for contemplation. I keep thinking about Sophie's question, Emma said without preamble, about you teaching her to drive. All the things you won't be here for. David nodded. He'd been thinking about it too. Graduations and birthdays, Sophie's first heartbreak, Tommy's little league games, all the ordinary milestones that make up a life. I've been writing letters, he said quietly. For their birthdays, for when they graduate, for when they get married. Your mother knows where they are. Emma's eyes filled with tears. It's not the same. No, it's not. But it's something. And, Emma, he turned to face her fully. I need you to promise me something. Don't let my death define their childhood. Don't let grief become the main story. Let them remember the fishing trip and the camping weekend and the way I always let them win at checkers. How can I not let it define things? You're their grandfather. You're supposed to be there for all of it. I am there for all of it. Just differently than we planned. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching bees work among the late-blooming roses. Emma had inherited David's love of gardens, and she understood the metaphor he was offering, without him having to explain it. I'm scared, she finally admitted. Not just about losing you, but about taking care of Mom afterward. About helping the kids understand. About carrying all these memories alone. You won't be alone. You have Michael. You have Jake. You have friends. And Emma. David reached for her hand. You're stronger than you think. You always have been. Remember when you were 16 and convinced you couldn't handle AP chemistry? You not only handled it, you got the highest grade in the class. That was different. That was just school. This is different too, but the strength is the same. You'll find it when you need it. The hardest conversation was with Catherine, not because it was emotionally difficult, though it was, but because they'd been having it in pieces for weeks, circling around the practical realities of what came after. It happened on a Saturday morning in early November, while Emma was at the store and Michael was at the hospital. David and Catherine sat at their kitchen table with coffee and the morning newspaper, the scene so familiar and domestic that it felt surreal to be discussing end-of-life arrangements. I want to stay home, David said. Not for the first time. When it gets bad, I want to be here, not in a hospital. Catherine nodded. They'd discussed hospice care, made arrangements. Dr. Martinez had been helpful in explaining what to expect, how to manage David's comfort in familiar surroundings. I know, we've got everything set up. And after. I want you to travel, Kat. Take that trip to Ireland you've been talking about for 20 years. Don't wait until you feel ready because you might never feel ready. David, I mean it. I want you to live fully after I'm gone. Not immediately. Take time to grieve, to adjust. But don't spend years waiting for permission to be happy again. Catherine stared into her coffee cup, watching cream swirl in patterns that reminded her of clouds. How am I supposed to want to see Ireland without you? Everything we planned together. Then see it for both of us. Send me postcards. He smiled at her confusion. Not literally, but in your mind. Show me things through your eyes, the way you always have. They talked about practical things too. Finances, the house, decisions that would need to be made. But underneath the logistics ran a current of deeper conversation about what their life together had meant, what parts of David would continue in Catherine and their children and grandchildren. Do you remember, David said as they were clearing the breakfast dishes, that night when Emma was about 3 and she had that terrible fever? We took turns sitting with her, and around 4 a.m. you fell asleep in the rocking chair, with her in your arms. Catherine smiled at the memory. You covered us both with the blue blanket. I stood there looking at the two of you, and I thought, this is everything. This moment, right here, is everything I ever wanted from life. Just a sick toddler and an exhausted wife. The woman I loved taking care of the child we'd made together. Complete contentment in the middle of an ordinary crisis. Catherine stopped loading the dishwasher and turned to look at her husband. After 30 years of marriage, he could still surprise her with these moments of poetry, these glimpses into the depth of his feelings. I've felt that way 1,000 times over the years, he continued. Watching you work in the garden, listening to you laugh with the children, seeing you concentrate on a difficult book. Just complete gratitude for the life we built. I need you to know, Catherine said, her voice thick with tears she was trying not to shed, that these past few months, even with everything that's happening, have been some of the happiest of my life. Not happy in spite of the circumstances, but happy because of them. Because we're saying everything that needs to be said. Because we're not taking a single moment for granted. David set down the plate he'd been drying and pulled Catherine into, his arms there in their kitchen with the morning light streaming through the windows and Max sleeping in his favorite spot by the door. That's all any of us can do, he said softly. Love completely while we can. Everything else is just details. Outside, the wind picked up, sending the last autumn leaves swirling past their window. Soon it would be winter, and then spring would come again, and life would continue its ancient rhythm. But this moment, this kitchen, this love, this was eternal in ways that transcended time and circumstance. December came early that year, bringing with it the kind of snow that transforms ordinary neighborhoods into winter wonderlands. David watched it fall from the hospital bed that had been set up in their living room, positioned so he could see, both the garden he loved and the family room where everyone gathered. The transition from active to comfort care had happened gradually, then all at once. One Tuesday, David had felt well enough to help Catherine with breakfast. By Friday, simple tasks like walking to the bathroom required assistance. By the following Monday, Dr. Martinez had gently suggested it was time to focus entirely on keeping David comfortable. Emma had moved back home completely, sleeping on the couch so she could be nearby if her father needed anything during the night. Michael had taken a leave of absence from his residency, despite his supervisor's concerns about his training timeline. Some things are more important than career advancement, he'd told Catherine when she worried about him jeopardizing his future. The house had taken on a different rhythm, quieter but somehow more alive than before. Neighbors brought food they didn't ask for permission to leave on the front porch. David's old college roommate flew in from Seattle just to sit beside the bed and reminisce about their shared memories. The mailman who had delivered to their address for 15 years started leaving handwritten notes along with the bills and catalogs. Sophie and Tommy had been told that Grandpa was very sick and that his body was too tired to get better. Sophie, with the pragmatism of childhood, had accepted this information and appointed herself in charge of making sure Grandpa always had his favorite butterscotch candies within reach. Tommy at 4 understood less but sensed the solemnity of the situation and spoke in whispers whenever he entered the living room. "Tell me about the roses," David said one afternoon, his voice weaker than it had been even that morning. Catherine, was reading in the chair beside his bed, but she set her book aside immediately. They're covered in snow right now, but the bushes look healthy. I think we'll have a beautiful bloom next spring. The red ones always were your favorites, because you planted them for our 10th anniversary. Do you remember? You were so secretive about it, sneaking out to the garden after I went to bed. David smiled, though the effort seemed to cost him. I wanted to surprise you with something that would last, something beautiful that would come back every year. Catherine reached for his hand, finding it cooler than she'd expected. They've come back every year for 13 years. They'll keep coming back. Promise me you'll take care of them, even when it's hard to do the things that remind you of me. I promise. That evening, the whole family gathered in the living room. Jake had brought the grandchildren for what everyone understood might be their last visit with Grandpa, while he was still alert enough to enjoy their company. Sophie had made a drawing at school, a picture of the whole family standing in a garden full of red roses. She'd used an entire red crayon to color the flowers, pressing so hard that the paper was slightly torn in places from her enthusiasm. "This is you and Grandma and Mommy and Uncle Michael and Daddy and me and Tommy," she explained, pointing to each stick figure in turn. "And this is Max, and these are all your roses." David studied the drawing with the seriousness it deserved. "This is the most beautiful picture I've ever seen," he said, and Sophie beamed with pride. Tommy, less interested in art but deeply fascinated by the mechanical hospital bed, kept asking to make it go up and down. Michael showed him the controls, and for 10 minutes the living room was filled with Tommy's delighted giggles as the bed moved in small increments. "Grandpa, does it hurt?" Sophie asked suddenly, with the directness that children possess before they learn that some questions make adults uncomfortable. David considered the question seriously. "Sometimes," he said honestly. "But right now, with all of you here, I feel wonderful." Jake had been quiet most of the evening, standing slightly apart from the family cluster around David's bed. He'd married into this family 8 years ago, but the depth of their closeness in crisis had shown him something about love and loyalty that his own more distant family had never demonstrated. "David," he said finally, "I need to tell you something. You've been more of a father to me than my own dad ever was. Thank you for welcoming me so completely into this family." David's eyes filled with tears. "Jake, you've made my daughter happy and given me the most wonderful grandchildren. You've been a gift to all of us." As the evening progressed, stories began to flow. Michael shared memories from his childhood, camping trips where David had patiently taught him to build fires and identify constellations. Emma talked about how David had attended every single one of her high school theater performances, even the terrible one where she forgot half her lines. "Remember when I was 8 and decided I wanted to build a treehouse?" Emma said, curled up on the floor beside the bed like she used to do during family movie nights. "You spent 3 entire weekends helping me, even though the tree in our backyard was completely unsuitable for any kind of structure. We made it work," David said softly. "It lasted almost 2 whole months before that windstorm knocked it down, but those 2 months I felt like I had built something amazing, like I could accomplish anything if I just worked hard enough and had the right help." Catherine listened to these stories with a mixture of joy and heartbreak. This was what would continue after David was gone. These memories, these lessons, these moments of connection that had shaped their children into the adults they'd become. Around 9 o'clock, Sophie started to get sleepy, curling up in the chair beside Catherine. Tommy had already fallen asleep in Jake's arms, thumb in his mouth despite being officially too old for such comfort. "I think it's time to get these little ones home," Jake said quietly. The goodbyes were longer than usual, filled with extra hugs and whispered, "I love yous." Sophie kissed David's forehead and promised to draw him another picture tomorrow. Tommy, sleepy and confused, patted David's hand and said, "Feel better soon, Grandpa." After they left, the house settled into its nighttime quiet. Emma went to make tea, and Michael stepped outside to call his attending physician about his extended leave. For a few minutes, Catherine and David were alone. "I'm tired, Kat," David said, and something in his voice told her he meant more than just sleepy. "I know, sweetheart, it's okay to rest." Will you stay with me tonight? Here, I mean, not in the bedroom. Catherine had been sleeping in their bedroom, maintaining some sense of normal routine even as everything else changed. But tonight felt different, more urgent somehow. Of course. Emma brought pillows and blankets, transforming the chair beside David's bed into something resembling comfortable. Michael checked his father's medication schedule and made sure everything was within easy reach. We'll be right here, Emma said, settling onto the couch where she'd been sleeping. Just call if you need anything. The house grew quiet except for the familiar sounds of night. Max's gentle snoring from his bed in the corner, the old furnace, cycling on and off, the occasional creak of settling wood. Catherine held David's hand in the darkness, listening to his breathing, memorizing the rhythm that had been the soundtrack to her nights for 23 years. Somewhere around 3 a.m, David woke and squeezed her hand 3 times. Catherine, dozing lightly, felt the pressure immediately and squeezed back 4 times. I love you too, she whispered. Thank you, David said, so quietly she almost didn't hear him. For everything, for the life we built together, for loving me so completely. Thank you for loving me back. They talked in whispers until dawn began to lighten the windows, sharing final thoughts and memories, saying things that had been too sacred for daylight conversations. When Emma and Michael woke up, they found their parents still holding hands, still talking softly, still loving each other with the same intensity they'd brought to their very first conversation in that university library decades ago. Outside, snow continued to fall, covering David's roses in a blanket of white that would protect them through the winter until they could bloom again in spring. David passed away on a Tuesday morning in January, with snow falling gently outside the living room windows and his family surrounding him with love. It happened the way the hospice nurse had said it might. Peacefully, quietly, as if he were simply drifting off to sleep after a very long day. Catherine was reading to him from his favorite book of poetry, when his breathing grew softer, and then, between one moment and the next, stopped altogether. Emma and Michael were there, one on each side of the bed, holding their father's hands as he let go of the world with the same grace he'd shown in living in it. The silence that followed was profound, not empty, but full of something that felt like completion. Max, who had been lying quietly by the bed for the past 3 days, got up and padded over to Catherine, resting his head on her knee as if he understood that his job now was to comfort those left behind. The days that followed passed in a blur of arrangements and visitors, casseroles and flowers, phone calls and decisions that seemed both overwhelmingly important and completely irrelevant. David had planned his own memorial service with characteristic thoughtfulness, requesting music he loved and asking that people share stories rather than formal eulogies. The service was held at the community center where David had volunteered, for years helping with literacy programs and tax preparation for elderly residents. The room filled beyond capacity with people standing along the walls and spilling out into the hallway. Neighbors and colleagues, old friends and new ones, people whose lives David had touched in ways large and small. Michael spoke first, sharing the story of David teaching him to ride a bicycle in the driveway of their first house. He ran alongside me for what felt like miles, Michael said, his voice steady despite the tears on his cheeks. And when he finally let go and I realized I was riding on my own, he was cheering louder than anyone. That's who my dad was. Someone who helped you find your own strength and then celebrated when you used it. Emma shared the story of the unsuccessful treehouse, drawing laughter from the crowd as she described David's determined efforts to create architectural stability from an unsuitable oak tree and an 8-year-old's ambitious vision. But it was Catherine's words that left the lasting impression, spoken not from the podium but from her seat in the front row, her voice carrying clearly through the hushed room. David once told me that love doesn't end just because someone isn't physically here anymore, she said. I didn't understand what he meant at the time, but sitting here, looking at all of you, seeing the ways that David's life touched yours, and continues to touch yours, I'm beginning to understand. Love isn't something that dies, it transforms. It becomes the kindness you show to strangers, the patience you have with your children, the way you tend to gardens and relationships and all the growing things in your life. She paused, looking around the room at faces wet with tears and bright with memories. David isn't gone, He's in Michael's determination to heal people, in Emma's fierce protection of her family, in Sophie's curiosity about the world, in Tommy's generous heart. He's in the roses that will bloom in our garden this spring, and in the stories we'll tell about him for years to come. He's in every act of love and kindness that ripples out from this room into the world. After the service, people lingered, reluctant to let the gathering end. Stories continued to flow. The mechanic who remembered how David had helped him learn to read, the young mother whose children David had tutored in math, the elderly neighbor whose driveway David had quietly shoveled for 3 winters without ever mentioning it. In the weeks that followed, Catherine discovered the full extent of David's quiet generosity. Anonymous donations to local charities that were traced back to him. Students whose college tuition had been mysteriously supplemented. A scholarship fund at the community college that had been established years earlier in both their names, though Catherine had never known about it. He didn't want recognition, Dr. Martinez explained when Catherine called to thank her for the beautiful letter she'd sent. But he did want to make sure his death meant something. He asked me once if I thought he'd lived a meaningful life. I told him that meaningfulness isn't measured in grand gestures, but in the accumulated weight of small kindnesses. By that measure, your husband lived one of the most meaningful lives I've ever had the privilege to witness. Spring came early that year, and with it, David's roses bloomed more abundantly than Catherine could remember. She found herself spending hours in the garden, not just tending to the flowers but talking to them, sharing stories about her days and her memories, feeling David's presence in the work of her hands and the beauty that surrounded her. Sophie visited often, usually bringing new drawings or stories from school. She had processed her grandfather's death with the matter-of-fact acceptance that children often bring to life's mysteries, but she still saved him butterscotch candies and sometimes asked Catherine to tell Grandpa about things that happened in her life. Tommy, now 5 and more verbal, had developed the habit of patting the roses and saying, "Hi, Grandpa," whenever he visited the garden. Catherine never corrected him, understanding instinctively that children often see truths that adults convince themselves to doubt. Michael completed his residency that June, and at the graduation ceremony, Catherine could feel David's pride as surely as if he were sitting beside her. Emma returned to work gradually but with a new perspective on what mattered most. Jake told Catherine privately that watching David's death had changed him, made him more present with his own family, more aware of how quickly everything could change. 6 months after David's death, Catherine finally took the trip to Ireland they'd planned together for so many years. She packed light but brought David's favorite camera and a small notebook where she wrote letters to him each evening, describing the countryside and the people she met, the music she heard, and the stories she collected. Standing on the cliffs of Moher, watching the Atlantic Ocean stretch endlessly toward the horizon, Catherine felt David's presence as clearly as she felt the wind on her face. Not in a supernatural sense, but in the way that deep love becomes part of who you are, inseparable from your own heartbeat and breath. She pulled out her phone and took a selfie, something she'd never done before David's death, but something that felt important now. In the photo, she was smiling, her hair wild from the ocean wind, her eyes bright with tears and joy and the kind of aliveness that comes from carrying someone's love with you into new experiences. That evening, in a small pub in a village whose name she couldn't pronounce, Catherine listened to traditional Irish music and thought about the stories David would have told about the musicians, the questions he would have asked about their instruments and their traditions. She bought a small wooden whistle from the guitar player, not because she knew how to play it, but because David would have been enchanted by its simple beauty. When she returned home 2 weeks later, Catherine found that Emma had been caring for the roses with religious devotion, and Michael had installed a small bench in the garden with a simple inscription, "For David, who taught us that love is a verb." The first anniversary of David's death arrived with surprising gentleness. Instead of the crushing grief Catherine had anticipated, she woke feeling grateful for the time they'd had, for the love they'd shared, for the way his death had brought their family closer together, rather than tearing them apart. They marked The day with a family gathering in the garden, sharing stories and planting new roses alongside David's originals. Sophie, now 8 and gap-toothed, read a poem she'd written about grandfathers and gardens. Tommy, more coordinated at 5, helped dig holes for the new bushes with the seriousness of someone performing important work. As evening fell and Jake gathered the children to head home, Catherine remained in the garden with Emma and Michael. They sat on David's bench, watching fireflies begin to flicker among the roses, comfortable in the silence that had replaced the urgent need for constant talking that had marked the early days of grief. "Do you think he knows?" Emma asked eventually. "About all of this? About how we're doing?" Catherine considered the question, looking at the roses that had returned faithfully each spring, at her children who had grown into people David would be proud of, at the life that continued to unfold in beautiful and unexpected ways. "I think love creates its own form of eternity," she said finally, "not because there's some cosmic scoreboard keeping track, but because when you love someone completely, they become part of how you see the world. David's love is still here, because we're still here, still carrying it forward." Michael nodded, understanding in the way that doctors understand the difference between clinical death and the continuation of influence, the way that healing continues long after the healer is gone. As they finally went inside, Catherine paused to touch one of the red roses David had planted for their 10th anniversary. Tomorrow, she would call the community college about expanding David's scholarship fund. Next week, she would volunteer at the literacy center where he'd taught adults to read, not because she felt obligated to continue his work, but because his love had taught her that meaningful lives are built from accumulated acts of kindness, and she wanted to continue building something meaningful with the time she had left. Inside the house, Max was waiting by the door, tail wagging with the patient devotion that dogs bring to the work of loving the living. Catherine scratched his ears and looked around at the photos and memories that filled their home, feeling not the weight of loss but the lightness of gratitude. David was gone, but love remained, and in the end, that was everything.